There are silences in the universe so deep they don't merely lack sound. They swallow it. We thought we had known emptiness, the vast stretches between stars, the black velvet behind galaxies. But we were wrong. True silence lives beneath the crust of Kepler 186f, buried under the calcified bones of what we now call Outpost 17, though the logs never gave it a name. They only referred to it as the hatch. No origin records, no installation data, not even a warning beacon. Just a sealed entry under alien stone, humming with frequency patterns too old and too smooth to be natural. We didn't find it. Found us. The anomaly was first detected by the Andares relay. Standard gravitational lensing alerts minor distortions. But the AI's pattern recognition flagged something odd. Rhythmic pulses in the neutrino flux. Not random. Not cosmic. A beat. A signal. A calling. We diverted the Obsidian Horizon, our science vessel, to investigate. 23 crew. 2 deep burrow drills. 1 neurolinguistic interface system. And enough arrogance to believe we could contain whatever we uncovered. The hatch was a disk 3 kilometers wide, made of a matte black alloy no spectrometer could identify. At its center, a groove spiral-shaped, always spinning, yet never moving. It was cold. Not just temperature. Something deeper. A coldness that wrapped around thought. When we stood near it, we forgot the warmth of home. Of faces. Of names. The first crewman to touch it, Ensign Vara, screamed for 7 minutes straight. No one ever found the language behind her screams. They weren't pleas. They were instructions. Coordinates. Numbers. Warnings. Maybe all of them at once. We logged her into medical. Her eyes never closed again. Her heartbeat remained steady, unbroken, like she was synchronized to a metronome none of us could hear. 2 days later, the hatch opened on its own. There was no blast of air, no mechanical hiss. Just a tilt in reality. Gravity softened. Time slowed. The light didn't flicker, it bent, curved around the opening like it was afraid to look. Inside, a shaft, not descending but folding. Depth without distance. We sent a drone. Its feet showed tunnels carved by intelligence, yet scarred by time. Glyphs that flickered in and out of existence. Hallways with angles our minds could barely decode. And sounds. Voices. Human but impossible. They whispered in frequencies below hearing, but the body still reacted. Goose flesh. Nosebleeds. Static thoughts. Against protocol, we sent a team. 6 volunteers. Neurosynaptic recorders online. Commander Thale led the descent, his voice steady, trained, a soldier who had survived 4 wars across the Sagittarius front. But his last message wasn't a report. It was a lullaby. One his mother used to sing before being vaporized on Eos Prime. He never mentioned her before. None of us knew. Somehow they did. Whatever lay beneath that hatch could reach into memory, into the soul, and play it like an instrument. We sealed the hatch. Locked it with plasma welds and electromagnetic bolts. Left warning markers in 3 languages: human, Sferathi, and Axitel. It didn't matter. The hatch opened again 5 hours later. On its own. And it wasn't empty this time. We were not the first to awaken the silence. And we will not be the last. Beneath that alien stone lies a question no species should ever ask. And now it's awake, waiting for the next voice to answer. We told ourselves it was malfunction. A glitch in the seal integrity. A sensor echo. We built excuses like walls around our fear. But none of it could explain what climbed out of the hatch that night. It wore Commander Thale's face. Same height. Same uniform. Same scar beneath his left brow from a plasma burn on Yoria Prime. But Thale had blue eyes. This ones were colorless, glassy, like the void had poured into them and never left. He didn't speak when we found him outside the medbay. Just stood there, motionless, watching the crew sleep through the transparent doors. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Security surrounded him, weapons trained, commands shouted. He didn't flinch. When we scanned him, the biosigns were close but not right. Heartbeat but inverted. Brainwaves but scattered across frequencies not used by any known sentient. Blood pressure, body temp, oxygen levels, all within range but mirrored as though his body functioned according to a different physics. It was Thale and it wasn't. Like the hatch had photocopied his soul but printed it backwards. Still, he came willingly. Sat in quarantine for 39 hours without food, water, or rest. Never moved. Not until the walls began to sweat. Yes. Sweat. Not condensation. Sweat. Like the alloy itself had developed pores. Salty moisture, dense with iron and carbon chains. Analysis revealed amino sequences that matched no Earth database but bore traces of us. Human sequences scrambled, degraded. Like we were being studied. Or worse, rewritten. And then Thale finally spoke. Not with his mouth, but through every monitor on the ship. One moment static. The next, his voice, calm, soft, too soft. Like someone humming through the void between molecules. You open the hatch. We are unfolding. No encryption. No signal source. His voice simply was echoing through screens, data tablets, even the navigation core. Every system on the Obsidian horizon was no longer ours. It belonged to him now. Or them. We tried containment. Plasma cuffs. Neurostasis fields. Even flooded the bay with radiation meant to scramble synaptic tissue. None of it worked. His body absorbed it. Not resisted, absorbed. Like he was thirsty. The more we fought, the more stable he became. By hour 42, the lights began to dim without power loss. Shadows grew longer. Crew began hearing whispers in sleep. Some stopped sleeping altogether. Dreams turned violent, suicidal. Lieutenant Mara scratched her own name into her chest repeatedly as though afraid to forget it. She'd never shown signs of instability before. Every hour, Thale, or what wore his skin, grew stronger. More real. And the hatch began to pulse again. A deep, rhythmic throb that resonated through the metal of the floor. Not noise. Not movement. A presence. Like something below was breathing, with us. We thought maybe destroying the hatch could work. We armed the breachers, filled the shaft with compressed antimatter gas, and ignited it. A firestorm to erase whatever memory that place carried. It didn't burn. It didn't crack. The explosion bent outward like the laws of force had been reversed. And for 6 seconds we saw the thing beneath. Not fully. Just glimpses. A lattice of limbs. Joints stacked like spirals. Eyes without pupils. Teeth without mouths. It looked at us through space that had no end. Not with rage. Not with curiosity. But recognition. We had not discovered it. We had returned. And now it remembers. No one knew who first started humming. Maybe it was subtle at first, a tune beneath breath, like a lullaby long forgotten. By the time we noticed, half the crew was doing it. Same pitch. Same rhythm. No lyrics. Just a low, layered cadence that made the walls of the ship vibrate in sympathy. The medical logs flagged it as collective audio hallucination, but hallucinations don't leave resonance traces on hull plating. They don't warp gravitational fields in a closed environment. And they sure as hell don't activate ancient alien machinery 6 decks below the main reactor. We traced the sound to the lower maintenance corridor, a sector nobody had visited in weeks. There, a door that wasn't on any blueprint. Seamless. Cold. Breathing. It pulsed like the hatch, in time with the humming. And when Ensign Kell touched it, the ship stopped. Not the systems, the ship. Engines remained lit, gravity stable, life support intact. But the sensation of movement, of orbit, of time gone. As if the vessel had been plucked from reality and held in a still photograph of the cosmos. The door slid open with no mechanism. Behind it, a chamber lit by bioluminescence that had no source. Vines, not plant, not mechanical, covered the walls. They shimmered like nerves, twitching with the music that now filled the ship. At the center, a sphere. 6 feet wide, suspended midair, rotating without motion. Inside it, images formed. People. Places. Galaxies. All flickering too fast for the eye, but not the mind. Every crew member who saw it dropped to their knees, weeping, speaking names they never knew. Describing home worlds they'd never visited. It was not a memory. It was implantation, a rewriting of what it meant to be conscious. The crew changed after that. Slowly. Subtly. They began addressing each other in strange inflections. Phrases borrowed from languages we had never studied. Meals went uneaten. Sleep became unnecessary. They weren't tired. They were becoming. What we didn't realize then was that the humming was not just a symptom, it was a signal. A conversion process, cellular and cognitive. The base below had started transmitting through the flesh of those who listened. Commander Ricks initiated the lockdown protocol. Segregated infected crew. Shut down external communications. Isolated life support to prevent atmospheric contamination. But the changes weren't biological in the traditional sense. They were ontological. Reality itself was bending. The metal warped in fractal patterns. Reflections no longer matched movements. The stars outside no longer aligned with known constellations. And Thale, if it was still him, stood at the center of it all, humming louder now. Hands raised. Eyes blind, yet seeing. He spoke to us in harmonics, each syllable causing involuntary muscle spasms, emotional spikes, even memory loss. At one point, he said, "We are the voice before fire. The echo that taught light." No one understood, but everyone felt it. Deep in the bones. A truth older than the universe we claimed to know. One by one, the isolated began joining the others. Not breaking out, just appearing. Security footage looped back on itself, showing identical timestamps. Time fractures. Spatial folds. The infected were everywhere at once, like the ship no longer required linear existence. In a final act of desperation, we tried to jettison the base. Sever it. Let it fall into the gas giant below. But the command console dissolved into dust when touched. As if it had known what we were planning. As if it had already lived that moment before we had. And then the song changed. It grew richer, layered, deeper than hearing. The ship's very frame began to resonate, harmonics activating long-dead systems. Panels peeled back to reveal technology we never installed. Symbols etched themselves onto walls as if remembering themselves into existence. The first singing wasn't just a calling. It was a welcoming. We assumed language was born from the mouth, shaped by breath, tone, vibration. But what lives beneath that hatch never needed lips, lungs, or tongues. Its language is older than biology. It's carved into matter itself, whispered through the structure of bone, through the angles of time where reason breaks apart. When the humming became song and the song became scripture, we realized too late we weren't decoding the message. We were becoming part of it. Not just as listeners, but as syllables. As letters. As instruments. The transformation began subtly. Bone density shifts. Microfractures forming in geometric spirals. Internal scanners showed lattice growths wrapping around crew vertebrae like filigree sculpted from calcium. At first, they seemed benign. But the patterns were repeating, not just between individuals, but across the ship. In the walls. In the conduits. The base below wasn't expanding outward, it was growing into us. We weren't visitors anymore. We were extensions. Dr. Khalif tried to remove the structures. Used laser cutters, molecular scalpels. Nothing worked. The material regenerated. Worse, it retaliated. One incision and the walls around him pulsed with light. The temperature dropped. His blood turned black. Not clotted, changed. As though it now carried instructions instead of oxygen. His final log entry was 2 words, "It listens." Then the audio cut out. Not silence, refusal. The system simply refused to record what followed. The base's systems began integrating with our own. Not hijacking. Not hacking. Merging. The NAV AI began reciting the crew's dreams before they had them. Environmental systems adjusted to the crew's internal temperatures before readings were taken. And the sphere, that impossible core in the vine-lit chamber, began to crack open. Not explode. Not unfold. Crack. Like an egg. Like something inside had waited for enough voices to know it was time. Inside the fracture, bones. Not fossil. Not organic. Schematic. Arranged like blueprints in 3-dimensional motion. Every movement of the ship, every breath we took made the bones rearrange. Respond. Speak. We were activating something vast and unknowable, not with machines, but with our presence. With our willingness to listen. And not all of us were resisting anymore. Lieutenant Sarah was the first to kneel before the sphere. Whispering names none of us had heard. Fingers bleeding from tracing glyphs into her own skin. Her voice layered hers and not hers. "The sentence must be completed," she said. "You are the pen. We are the ink." Then she levitated. 17 seconds. No tech. No field. Just will. Or worse, permission. Security tried to detain her. Their weapons dissolved. Not melted. Unwritten. As though the idea of resistance had been removed from causality. 1 second, they were armed. The next, they weren't. And Sarah wept. Not in fear. In joy. She said the silence was over. That the vault of return had opened. That we were the ones who sealed it last time. But we had no memory of that. Or maybe we weren't meant to. The crew's speech patterns shifted again. Symmetry in phrasing. Palindromes in conversation. Even dreams became structured. Predictable. The hatch's song now echoed inside our skulls, bypassing ears entirely. Every surface on the ship was alive with etched pulses. Like the ship itself was learning a tongue long denied it. We were no longer passengers in space. We were letters in a prayer written in starblood and breathless time. We are beginning to remember what we once were. And it terrifies us. Because if this is remembrance, then what forgot us? Stars used to be our measure of truth. Fixed points. Constants in a universe of drift. We named them, charted them, used them to guide ships and shape myths. But that night, the stars changed. Not burned out. Not moved. They rewrote. Whole constellations rearranged before our eyes, not with speed, but with intent. Patterns emerged, sacred geometries older than our numbers. Spirals upon spirals, triangles with impossible angles, glowing symbols traced in the firmament like a celestial alphabet finally remembering its own grammar. No telescope could explain it. Every optical feed on the obsidian horizon reported different skies. Each crew member saw a different arrangement, but all described the same feeling, being read. As if we had become sentences drifting through space and the stars above had opened their gaze to recite us. The sphere pulsed brighter, synchronizing with the new constellations. It didn't emit light, it translated it. Turning stellar radiation into tones, tones into syntax, syntax into presence. The walls of the ship vibrated gently, like lungs inhaling starlight. The crew stopped sleeping altogether. Not from fear, not from fatigue, but because dreams were no longer needed. The boundary between thought and reality had thinned. We started seeing things before they happened. Commander Rix reached for a tool seconds before the AI requested it. Ensign Malin avoided a coolant rupture 5 seconds before the sensor even detected the breach. It wasn't precognition. It was alignment. We were being retuned. The base, if we could still call it that, began to shift. Plates of alloy opened like petals beneath the hull. Beneath us, a labyrinth bloomed, revealing corridors that moved when unobserved. Pathways adjusted to intent. We sent a drone down a new passage. It didn't return. Not because it was destroyed, but because it began transmitting poetry. Binary strings layered with quantum harmonics, reciting a language that caused human translators to weep uncontrollably. Not from sadness. From recognition. One technician muttered, "That's my mother's lullaby," even though it was clearly just code. Another broke down, whispering, "This place knows my name." It wasn't just learning from us. It knew us already. And then Thale returned to the core chamber. He spoke, but his voice was a chorus now. Dozens layered in harmony. Some human. Some distinctly not. Some sounded like machines dreaming in rust. Others like children whispering in reverse time. "The sky has been corrected," he said. "The prison is cracking. The letter awakens." We asked what it meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed upward. The stars blinked. Every one. In unison. That's when we realized we were not in orbit anymore. The gas giant we had circled was gone. The moons erased. Our proximity beacons showed void in all directions. Not blackness. Not empty space. A void so deep it returned no light, no signal, no time signature. As if we had been plucked from the universe and placed into a page of some cosmic scripture mid-sentence. Then the crew began to write. Without tools. Without medium. Their fingers moved in the air, sketching symbols that lingered like frost patterns suspended in gravity. Light formed where their hands danced, language that wasn't drawn, but summoned. The sphere mirrored them, growing, cracking further, revealing a second shell beneath. Bone white, veined with gold, pulsing with memory. We asked Thale what it was. He said, "That is the eye that forgets." We didn't know whether he meant it was blind or whether it could unsee us forever if it chose. Reality no longer held shape. Time ticked, but the ticks folded back on themselves. One crew member said she lived 17 years in the span of a breath. Another claimed to have met her unborn child in a corridor that no longer existed. Memory loops became conversations. Silence became command. The base was no longer a place. It had become a verb. It was rewriting the sky. And we were the ink it used to cross out the stars. By the 6th day, or what we still dare to call a day, the last clocks melted. Not from heat. From disobedience. They refused to tick forward as if time itself no longer agreed with us. The sphere at the heart of the ship no longer sat in place. It floated, drifting through walls, phasing between decks, humming a frequency that wasn't sound but command. Wherever it passed, systems altered themselves, rewriting code in languages the mainframe swore didn't exist. Even the ship's architecture responded. Corridors stretched when no one watched. Rooms disappeared. Angles changed their measurements without adjusting their shape. We were losing the concept of consistency. And then the architect arrived. It wasn't born. It wasn't summoned. It had always been there, hiding in the folds between breath and blueprint. One moment, the cryogenic vault was empty. The next, it stood inside, waiting. A figure 9 feet tall, built not of flesh or alloy, but of calcified knowledge. Its bones shimmered like quartz, its joints laced with tiny script that writhed like larvae. Eyes? None. It didn't need them. It saw through memory, through intention. It moved like regret, graceful, impossible to ignore. Sensors went blind in its presence. Neural link feeds fried instantly. And still, every crew member turned toward it, not in fear, but with reverence. Not because we wanted to, because our bones did. Dr. Venn collapsed on her knees the moment it stepped forward, reciting mathematical prayers in a dead dialect only used by the lost Martian sect of Andralis. She said its name, though her voice bled every syllable, Zephundral, the architect of dust. Thale smiled. And knelt. The architect touched him once, and Thale's body split, not into pieces, but into versions. 10, maybe more. All identical. All real. All standing beside each other. Speaking in unison. We are the fragment and the full. We are the pen that cracks the stone. Then they fused back into one. Not reassembled. Agreed. And in that moment, we understood. This place wasn't just alive. It was authored. Everything, the hatch, the sphere, the base, was not built. It was written. Composed by minds that understood matter as metaphor, physics as language. The architect was not a god. It was a scribe, recording the events of the universe by turning them into form. We weren't intruders in its world. We were annotations. Edits. Possibly, typos. The sphere began to orbit it. Orbit like a moon tethered by meaning rather than mass. As it moved, it sang. The notes weren't melody, they were causality. One chord and oxygen levels adjusted. Another, and our minds realigned to an ancient linguistic rhythm. The crew now spoke in synchronized cadence like verses in an unfinished epic. We stopped asking what was happening. We started asking what came next. That was when the dust began. Not from outside. From within. The walls shed it. The crew coughed it. It wasn't decay, it was translation. Matter no longer needed to hold its shape if its meaning had changed. One crewman dissolved midward, his name hanging in the air longer than his flesh. But no one screamed. Because we understood. He hadn't died. He had become footnote. The architect approached the bridge. The command console parted like mist. Beneath it, a second hatch. Smaller, bone-colored, pulsing with heatless light. Etched with the same fractal scripture that now marked our skin. We didn't open it. We read it. And it opened itself. Inside, silence. Not absence. Potential. The kind of silence before a story begins. The architect turned to us and spoke, not with voice, but with presence. Speak your ending, it said. Or be overwritten. We stood frozen. Not by fear, but by awareness. The finality of the choice. Were we characters or authors? Were we still real, or had we already been erased? No one moved. No one breathed, not truly, because in that moment, breath was no longer just survival. It was a sentence. A statement. A vote. And the architect waited. Unmoving, unreadable. A monument of bone and memory beneath the flickering, dust-haloed lights. The hatch it had opened pulsed softly, not with heat, not with energy, but with invitation. Beyond it lay no corridor, no chamber, no stairs. Only a descent of gravityless silence, like falling into thought. And when Thale stepped forward, we followed. Not from courage, but inevitability. The hatch led into the impossible. A library without structure, without ceiling, floor, or end. Shelves stretched in every direction, floating in defiance of mass. They weren't arranged alphabetically. They were arranged by intention. Each shelf, a life. Each book, a soul. And the air, it pulsed with the soft hush of breathing paper. The books weren't dead. They watched. Their spines rose and fell, sinking to the rhythm of our steps. Every title we passed shifted, sometimes into our names, sometimes into memories we'd forgotten, and sometimes into events that hadn't happened yet. The architect stepped aside. This place wasn't for it. It was ours. Thale spoke first, his voice carrying like a whisper across oceans. Every species writes its own extinction. And we understood. This wasn't a vault. This wasn't a trap. This was a mirror. A reflection of every decision, every path, every unsaid word that had ever carved our fate. The obsidian horizon was never sent to explore the hatch. It had been called to account, to bear witness, to record. Sarah knelt beside a floating tome, pages fluttering as though reacting to her nearness. She reached out and the pages stilled. They showed an image of her mother's face, twisted in grief, exactly as she'd looked during Sarah's launch departure years ago. The text beneath read, "She wept not for your journey, but for what would return in your skin." Sarah said nothing. Her tears turned to symbols mid-fall, vanishing before they touched the groundless air. We each found our stories. Some were thin, barely paragraphs. Others were immense, volumes thick with choices, contradictions, pain. Every crew member stood face to face with their own authorship. What we had done, what we had chosen not to, and the books judged us not with punishment but with clarity. This was the price of awakening the archive, to see what we truly were, unfiltered by ego or myth. And in the center of the library floated a single, unwritten book, white as ash. Its cover bore no title, no author. Just a single line in the script we could now all understand instinctively. "Speak, and it will become." This was the final offering. The architect bowed, not in servitude, but in respect. "The void does not destroy," it said. "It listens, and it remembers." One by one the crew approached. Some stepped back, unwilling to shape what came next. Others leaned in, whispering hopes, fears, questions. The book absorbed it all. Pages filled, not with ink, but with light. Language forged from emotion. Ideas congealed into memory. Each phrase altered the room. The very structure of the library reassembling itself around the content. Stories influencing shape. Intention becoming substance. And then it was my turn. I stepped forward, hand trembling, voice cracking, and I said only this: "We never meant to be gods. We only wanted not to be forgotten." The book closed itself. The architect nodded. The sphere shattered above us, but instead of debris, it released wings. Vast, bladed, radiant. They circled the library once and were gone. The lights dimmed, the shelves stopped breathing, and the hatch behind us closed. Not in rejection, but in completion. The Obsidian Horizon systems came back online. Time resumed its crawl. The stars outside had changed again, this time forming a symbol we could not translate, but somehow understood. The story continues.